joined us, will be interpreting live. So thank you to those of you in the audience who are doing that interpretation. We appreciate you and your efforts and your talent and skill that you're sharing with us. One last note about today, there is also a happy hour session. So this is an open for dialogue session that occurs for the first 3 days of the symposium at 6 p.m. In Valparaiso, Santiago time. Registration is required, but it is open to everyone, and it's a space for open dialogue where the conversations that occurred today continue to evolve, and more voices can be incorporated. So it's not just the presenters speaking, but audience members and any of you who are here today. So it's really just a chance to continue that conversation, and we hope to see you there. The link we'll put later at the end of the conversation in the chat. It can also be found at any point on the website. So with that, I will get started. I am very pleased to introduce my colleagues, and I'll do so one by one as they begin to share their presentation. I'll be starting with Kevin Jones. Kevin Jones is an independent arts writer and educator and the founder of Juniper Mind, which we'll be talking about a fair bit today. He holds an MA in linguistic and semiotics from La Sorbonne Nouvelle. He lived and worked and is living and working in the Middle East, where he's been for over 13 years, but was originally born in New York and spent a great deal of time in Paris. He is devoted to fostering a critical voice on contemporary art in the Gulf region. And I believe this is one of the key threads that really binds this group together here today, is an interest to create critical conversations within these spaces in the Middle East, in South Asia, and North Africa. So Kevin has created these incredible spaces for dialogue that I am incredibly appreciative of and have been lucky to be a part of. So these spaces are for critical reflection within cultural communities by providing guidance and also mentorship for artists, consultations for cultural entities, and really just in general momentum for public programming that inspires creative minds. So Kevin is also the catalyst for my academic career, convincing me to be part of the visual literacy workshops that took place in 2020, which built a space for critical dialogue focusing on photography in particular, and also provided the theory that I needed to understand and pursue the research that I executed on COVID-19, which I'll talk about a little later. So the workshops that we are talking about today in visual literacy were developed with a consultancy entity called Juniper Mind that Kevin has created. And what I wanted to do when I pass this over to you, Kevin, and I will bring up your slides, is to prompt you by asking you a little bit more about how those visual literacy workshops began to take shape and what the goals were when you first initiated that. So with that, I will bring up the slides and hand it over to you, Kevin. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much, Miranda. That's one of the most golden introductions one could have asked for. And I'm also very happy to see familiar faces once again. So I've tried to take the angle of looking at this visual literacy course in terms of its origin, just kind of framing where it came from. And I mean, so Juniper Mind, as Miranda said, was a consultancy entity, which sort of doesn't really exist anymore. But in the time that visual literacy existed, had the vocation of sort of, as Miranda said again, kind of creating these spaces of exchange. And the origin of visual literacy, again, I feel came from what probably has been addressed many times in this symposium, and which Miranda and I have spoken about at great length, the sort of lack of opportunities to decode images and to sort of bring a kind of critical understanding of them, media images particularly. But I think I'll end this talk by opening up to understanding that potentially that they're not necessarily always media images that are hinged entirely to current events. If you can move to the next slide, Miranda. In 2020, the summer of 2020, this idea for visual literacy emerged. And I have to say that it was really deeply influenced by a lot of the pedagogical thinking that I was doing around the time that was inspired by Rohit Goyal, who will speak at the end of this. So Rohit, who runs an institute called Bikar, based in Bombay, and I worked together under the auspices of Bikar, co-teaching something. But again, his own pedagogical curiosity trickled down into a lot of the thinking, and was a big driver for wanting my own wanting to try to do something like this in the first place. So the summer of 2020, many of you remember, were probably very bored sitting at home and just like looking for outlets of things to do and things to think about. And I decided to start thinking about this idea of it wasn't even called visual literacy at this point. I knew I wanted to do something around images through these three specific angles. One was about the gaze. This was a course in which we looked very deeply at all of the kind of theoretical part of the gaze, but also more practical applications of it, ideology and how images are sort of infiltrated by different ideologies, and the idea of mistrusting imagery. So you can see sort of the pace at which this stuff was delivered: April, May, June, and then June again. It was a pretty brisk endeavor. This is, I mean, again, we kind of defaulted to sort of marketing flourishes that, now that I look back on them, look rather clumsy. So maybe the next slide you can move to, and increasingly clumsy marketing. Each of these sessions also comprised a series of films. So, for example, for the gaze, we looked at a classic, Hitchcock's Rear Window. For images and ideology, we looked at some works by Harun Farooqi. These films were chosen as kind of offshoots of the classes themselves, but provided spaces of again, almost application of analysis that came out during the workshop. So these were sort of kind of separate or parallel fora in which people could sort of then dive into almost, I would say, largely popular cultural references of these things. We looked also at Paris is Burning, a film on the ball, culture in the gaze, and in Mistrusting Images, there was a great sort of film called The Viewing Booth, which confronts Palestinian and Israeli image manipulation. And then this evolved. I mean, to Miranda's point about methods and methodology, the next slide will sort of details a little bit what the objectives were in doing this. This was a sort of pedagogical plan, for lack of a better tool. But there's this idea of the rhetoric of images that was somehow not necessarily that it was impenetrable, but nobody seemed to be bothering to offer a forum in which it could be addressed. And I think this notion of manipulation, which you see in ideas of mistrusting imagery, for example, is also something that constituted an objective and something that I wanted to work through. And then over the following year, this evolved, and it sort of, I guess I realized that on the next slide, you'll see that, again, marketing to the rescue, it takes a different form. And this is where it actually starts to address visual literacy. This is now more an outcome, right? This is now sort of saying, okay, we want to move towards kind of skilling in a way, or at least kind of peeling away critical layers so that people are becoming a little bit more sensitized to the process by which one becomes literate. And then again, this is purely a reaction to the imagery that was everywhere with COVID, and that seemed, again, largely none of the conversations that I was hearing really was unpacking enough the way that imagery was kind of complicit sometimes with larger messaging that seemed important to get out on in times of crisis by state powers, let's say, individually. And so the next slide, Miranda, again, we'll talk about this in much greater detail, but this was the sort of the game plan, if you like, that visual literacy is challenging this idea of faith that we have in imagery. It's trying to help us read imagery. And I think the idea of literacy was to give people, at least put people on a path of understanding practices of seeing, that this is the idea of actually this is a daily thing. This is not something you learn and move away, that you become skilled at sort of actually interrogating images, and that you have a practice much in the same way that an artist has a practice or a writer has a practice. On the next slide, again, this idea of decoding was very important because I came at this almost semiotically. I would say that in the early courses there was very much an idea of looking at different layers of coding that was going on in a lot of the different images that we would see. On the next slide, you see a methodology of this, more or less, that we're looking through codes and symbols and kind of the indexical as well. This was a sort of guide, but very often we would sort of try to unpack and decipher these images. And again, both Jolene and Miranda contributed to this methodology. And the methodology was never strict. It was never imposed as like, you must follow this. But I think the first step of actually looking at the corpus of imagery that seemed interesting, and then sort of working into the codes and interrogating this. Can we move to the next slide then? And I think from there, it's all downhill. This is kind of, again, these were suggestions for sort of how do we sort of unpack these things critically, but both Miranda and Jolene took these in very different directions and worked with very different sets of images. And the next two set up a little bit what came after the COVID one, Protest, which was Jolene's, and then Beirut, which was taught by another collaborator, his name is Nadine Khalil. And in this one, we actually used less media imagery and more sort of photographers who identify with being fine arts photographers, I would say. So that sort of evolved it slightly. And then I guess the end of this presentation is simply to say that all of these things were excuses, right? I wasn't really interested in talking about COVID. I was really interested in talking about Beirut necessarily as part of that. I was really interested in talking about imagery, right? Because it didn't seem like anyone was doing that. And so all of these things were largely just sort of excuses to get people out of the room, but they were, significant hooks to bring people in. So I think, Miranda, you can probably speed through many things. Again, Beirut is an excuse I made before. And I think also that we've sort of, it's kind of become frozen because of other imperatives that have surfaced in my own life. So I haven't really invested beyond these two things. That's why I sort of look at it as the origin of a course as if it is this kind of thing in a petri dish or something that's just there and contained and over. But I would say that if we were to go forward with this, that it would be interesting to look at this as not just things that are hinged to current events. One of the ideas that we were thinking of when we were kind of actually seriously thinking about another iteration was around what does shame look like in imagery? And again, these ideas of a politician who has an affair and then kind of clusters with his beleaguered wife on the front steps of their home in Dorchester or something. And I get this idea of how does one compensate, how does one use the media as a means of sort of undoing shame, and what is that? What are those tropes looking like? But again, I think there's room to sort of look at it at a wider field rather than just looking at it in terms of current events and news media, say. And I think that's my final slide. Yeah, and again, I think this idea of the multivocal, I mean, it was really important for me to collaborate with other people. I did, and again, Rohit does this extremely elegantly as well. The different voices that get involved in the programming of stuff. It's never just one. It's never just one pedagogue, and sometimes it's not even actual pedagogues who are doing this. There's an idea of looking at everything, and increasingly, I believe that it's probably worth going beyond simply the single media of the photograph and, as I said, the news image, and to work through film, video, imagery, and certainly new media and digital media. I think that's it. Miranda.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin, for giving us that overview. I think it's incredibly helpful to understand, where did this idea come from? How was it built? And the point that you made in particular, that it wasn't necessarily about the COVID event or the protests or Beirut. It was using that as a lens through which to talk about images, because it seems to be the water that we swim in, and we often don't think about instead of just seeing and allowing it to influence us in certain ways and influence our ideas. So it worked so well because it was easy in the middle of the pandemic, for example, to say, okay, your homework is look at some COVID images, and the workshop individuals were like, yeah, like I have a choice, I will do that. And it became such a really interesting back and forth. So thank you for that. So next up, we will go to Jolene. So Jolene, thank you for being with us today. Jolene Frizzle is the director of the Institute for Emerging Art in Dubai, where she develops and oversees programs and facilitates creative projects, forming partnerships with leading institutions, both locally and regionally and internationally. Jolene has a MA in art history from University of Western Ontario, so another Canadian in the room. She takes on directorial roles and has in the past for art galleries in Zurich and London and Dubai. She has overseen curatorial projects, a plethora of which have been have occurred and have been wonderfully inspiring. She also mentors artists who benefit from her guidance and experience in the art world for more than a decade. So I had an opportunity to catch up with Jolene recently, and there was a sincere sense of joy when she spoke about engaging with emerging artists in the region. She contributes to a number of initiatives, particularly in the Emirates, which foster artistic production, critical perspectives, and community development. So Jolene and I both had the opportunity to lead workshops for the visual literacy program that Kevin had built and what he just discussed. Really guided by Kevin's pedagogical vision, we were able to create some really interesting conversations with the individuals who were part of the workshops. So Jolene's workshop was focusing on how mainstream media portrays protest. I attended the workshop and I thought it was incredible in terms of just being able to dissect how we're being presented, the people who engage in protest. And if that comes to mind as you read the news in the coming days, you'll notice that there are very particular approaches to that. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Jolene. Thank you so much for being with us, and I will bring up your slides just now as well.
Thank you, Miranda. Thank you to everyone for being here. And I'm really appreciative for Miranda for bringing us all together. The COVID time was it was an awkward time, and having the Zooms and having all these conversations together really was really a delight. So as everyone has mentioned, I did this workshop on protest as part of Kevin Jones's series. And really, I think what we were looking at a bit broader than that was, looking and scrolling at so many images and on so many platforms, it's really important to stop and think about what we're looking at. And really, to be honest, when do you take time to look and think about what you're seeing? Do you consciously read images? Do you notice the embedded biases, what the images are telling us? Do you notice their position that they're positioning themselves as? And what are we being conditioned to think? How are the images manipulating us? obviously, I think we all agree, and this was part of the tagline of visual imagery, no image is neutral. So what was really exciting about doing this course is that we had to kind of start decoding the messages and thinking about the tools and skills to see them critically so that we could become visual literacy. I was interested in looking at, my session was all about protests and looking at protests all around the world. At the time, there were protests happening, we were in Black Lives Matter, we had protests happening in Nigeria, we had protests happening in Poland with abortion. We had, every minute of the day, there seemed to be new protests that were coming to the fore and conversations that were being had. And so although the course is, sort of ended and my deep dive into sort of protest imagery has significantly lessened, my interest in the strategies of what's happening when these protest imagery comes about has not. And instead I remember when we were first doing this, I would be sending, every time I'd find a really cool COVID image, I would still keep sending it to Miranda, because the images, once you start kind of getting excited about them, they continue to really excite you. And so what I found, now nearly 2 years later after this course, that I've just found that this repetition of imagery is something that's really stuck with me. These links to sort of iconic compositions and iconic images, and this way that this repetition happens, I've just found that my personal viewing of imagery has also moved. It sort of shifted from the news media that Kevin, was talking about to social media. And so I want to go on to the next slide and look at an older image. And that sort of talks about for me, some of these iconic and origin images. This is an image from the Vietnam War. And you can sort of see, as this picture is showing us from the right and the left. On the right, we have this woman. She's larger than the images, the image on the left. You can see her. She has a definite character, a different personality versus the anonymous characters on the left. And you can kind of see that you're being told, this notion of the flower for peace, give peace a chance. And she's, what you're trying to do. In the next image, we have, I think, our most famous and most talked about image that we talked about in our thing. This was in Baton Rouge, and this was photojournalist Jonathan Bachman, and he was covering a Black Lives Matter rally, and he produced what was called an iconic arrest photo. But when we're looking at the image, what are the visual strategies used? The camera shot, the angle, the gaze, what are we seeing? So what I found was, a few people who had done some really deeper interpretations. When we move to the next slide, we've got someone who's really pulled apart all of the different kind of ways that the strategies for telling us what we're being told happen. And this was what was really interesting about these kinds of, deep dives and close leanings. In the middle on the left-hand side, you can see this crack in the highway, and the crack being, metaphoric for the crack that's happening in this situation. We have things about the shoes, how the shoes blend in. The shoes are kind of holding her down or keeping her to the ground. All these kinds of strategies are implicit in the photograph, and it was really exciting to talk about how these things kind of came to be and what they were doing for us. In the next slide, I found, I tried to put something in position, but when you look at this slide, and is this a reverse of the Vietnam War image that we saw a few slides ago? We have these figures, these police figures, they're still anonymous, but the scale of them versus the homeowners who are standing behind them, there's such a confrontation, and you can feel the spice of what was happening with the Black Lives Matter and this tension. And so I think it really highlights, the difference between the image before and the Vietnam image in terms of how these images are giving us implicit bias of what's happening in the imagery. I want to just go to the next slide and talk about this idea of the icon. And on the left here, we have the Angela Davis's poster from the FBI 10 Most Wanted that were issued after her arrest. And these images of her were cropped to kind of look like mugshots. And, the figure of Angela Davis has become an international symbol of resistance and a symbol of liberation. But as this movement, the image moved away from her, she said in a video that I saw, it took a while to grasp that the images existed independently from who I am. So I came to see that the image as having nothing to do with me and my particular history, but as standing in for a moment of millions of people all over the world that come together and accomplish something that was deemed impossible at the time. And so what I like about this is you sort of see how she has kind of become iconic and disassociated from the image itself, which you see in the image here on the left. That was a poster that was done. But then when we go into the next image and return to the protest of Black Lives Matter, we have here her image, her iconic image, and her voice in this struggle that continues to be a dominant and an important thought. If we go to the next slide, this is a little bit was just a really exciting development for me, was this connection of online and moving into the digital and moving into the online networks. The Milk Tree Alliance was an online democracy and human rights movement consisting mainly of people on the web from Hong Kong, Taiwan, Thailand, India, Burma, and it got its name because it was humorously, all these countries are well known for having tea with milk as one of their national drinks. And it became a movement against authoritarianism and advocating democracy, but it was leaderless. And the collaborations were really sharing tactics and strategies, and they were really helping each other, both boosting protest developments, but also sharing networks and sharing strategies. And I really just thought that there was a really exciting way that we've kind of started moving into the sort of digital, the digital sphere, and how this kind of movement moves into these different spaces. I just want to close with the next image, because unfortunately, the need for protest continues. And I wanted to share some images from Iran. But I wanted to, sort of talk about this idea that, while people have criticized the mainstream media for coming late to share what was happening, my field had been full of images of what was happening there. And so for me, this marked another important shift, that our social media becomes the site, the first site of dissemination. This was an Instagram colleague of mine, Dina Nasser Khadivi, and she's been posting every day videos, imagery, things that were happening. And you see in the middle image, this image of the child that we all have heard about, the children protesting, with the translation of women, life, freedom being written on her. So I want to just go to the last slide and talk about, like this Milk Tea Alliance, these pockets of support produce protests within the countries and outside. For the Iranian diaspora, their networks were activated, resulting in protests that went, around 5 countries in the world. It's an exciting example of how social media has also now changed how protests manifest themselves more and more. So I just, I want to close and just sort of thank you, and just talk about, this was some of the exciting images and some of the powers of imagery. And as the images, as images continue to flood your feed, I encourage you to become more critical and passionate about the visual literacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Jolene. That was wonderful, and it brings back the memories of those really incredible conversations that that were built in that space. And I agree with you. I think it really the workshop did become a catalyst for many of us to begin to really look more critically, which was the whole idea. That was Kevin's vision and something that we tried to champion. And I think it does work, in that it gets us to ask questions. And it's so easy to think about, as young people, we go to school and we're encouraged to ask questions about the articles we read, about the, stories that people tell orally, but all too often we just accept imagery as objective and as fact and as truth, and yet it embeds those biases that we really need to attend to. So those were wonderful examples, also, Jolene, that you shared, and I appreciate you putting that together and giving everyone a taste of what it would have been like to have been in those workshops that hopefully we'll be able to do again sometime soon. But thank you so very much for that. What I'd like to do next, and I will mention as well, if anyone in the audience has questions, drop them in the chat, and we'll revisit them as we get towards the end of the session. I thought I would follow Jolene in terms of sharing a little bit from the perspective of the COVID workshop. And so, much like Jolene focused on the topic of protest and how it is represented in visual communication and in particular mainstream media, I looked at the pandemic, and as I mentioned, it was good timing, being that the pandemic was occurring around all of us, and it also meant we were very captive at home, really interpreting the world first and foremost via the internet. So for those of us who are lucky enough to have access to the internet, acknowledging that the digital divide means there's still many people on the planet that don't have that access, for us that were lucky enough to have that, we began to understand this sort of invisible villain and virus through imagery and through text. But this was an image that I started the conversation with in the workshop that I still to this day reminds me of COVID. This seems in my mind to be a visual definition of COVID. And yet what's remarkable is that it looks like a microscopic image, and I think many in the audience of this image would assume that that is exactly what it is, but it wasn't. It was, oh, I'm not sharing screen, thank you. You really need to see this image to understand what I'm talking about. So hopefully this looks familiar, and thank you, Andrea, for giving me the heads up there. The importance of visuals. So this image hopefully looks familiar to many of you. It came out at a time where there were no visuals for the virus. It was really difficult to understand what it was in a visual sense, other than through charts and graphs, which are really not as impactful as something like this. But it communicates as if it's evidence, again, as if it's a microscopic image, and yet it was designed, it was created purposefully by designers, by illustrators who worked for the CDC. And when they created this image, they had certain strategies in mind. They said in an interview with the New York Times that the design and the coloring and the texture had to go along with the branding, and they didn't really elaborate on what that is. But how bizarre is it to imagine being in a room as an illustrator and creating a brand for a virus? And if those sort of advertising strategies are being applied to the images that we are seeing and downloading and understanding the pandemic through, what power is given to the illustrators in that moment, that critical moment internationally, for all of us to understand or begin to understand something? So this is quite concerning, and why it's concerning we spoke about in the workshop, because that image was used everywhere. People remixed it and recreated it, but really the dominant color scheme still continued. And it's understandable that red really represents things like caution and fire and attention and don't touch. So there's certainly logical reasons for choosing that color scheme. However, we also saw that idea of blame begin to emerge from different texts, different publications that would merge this literally and figuratively, pointing a finger, in this case, at China. This was run in the Financial Times. So it becomes a concern. So bias, in this case, is being embedded in an illustration. We also asked the participants in the workshop to look for, as Jolene mentioned, images that surround them. So they would go about their daily lives and continue to see what was emerging from the mainstream media, and they would bring those examples, submit them, and bring them to the next conversation. So this was one image that was a version of the original that one of the participants in the workshop brought through. And there were many more that were very strange, but it was a really interesting space to share what it was we were seeing together. and to begin to understand it, to decode it, and to acknowledge the issues, the biases, and the influences on the way that visual media is being presented. So these were a few of the themes that I pulled out from the research that I did. So I looked at hundreds of images across a number of mainstream media publications, primarily English, particularly because that's my limitation. But it was interesting to talk about these themes in the workshop with the participants. So themes like war, I think that rhetoric was also in verbal conversation where we heard discussions of the front line and things like that, but we also saw visual representations of that, blame of the other, which we just mentioned, and then technology as a savior is a really interesting theme that we discussed, and that problem of technology will be the solution for everything when there is just as many problems that are born out of technological advances as there are solutions. So also there was this harnessing of fear, which, in some cases was fear of crowds and agoraphobia, and that being visually represented, or we're replicating the imagery of the apocalypse, those images that we only saw in films with the empty streets and the empty shelves suddenly being harnessed to sort of take advantage of emotions, particularly in social media. And also this problematic idea of unity, where we saw elbow bumps and famous people with COVID and people banging pots and pans on their balcony, when we know that, particularly now from this perspective, that the virus was really affecting people in disproportionate ways based on issues of marginalization, of poverty, and so forth. So what I also found was an interesting conversation that we had in these spaces was a conversation about calling it out, which took different forms. So these were a couple of examples. Nana Kofi Akwa calling out the visual representation of death during COVID-19, particularly. Why is it that when there were a high number of deaths in Italy, the imagery was not showing bodies, whereas often when photographers are covering news in the African continent, it is significantly more graphic. So calling it out. Also, this was Islamophobia in the form of an image that was run by The Economist and quietly removed. So Mikdad Versi was calling that out and saying this is wildly unacceptable. The headline you can read, I'll not repeat it. But so that was another part of the conversation in the workshop. What if we call these things out in social media, in conversation? What if we demand better when we do see publications run imagery and accompanying text that embeds those unacceptable behaviors and biases? So recently I had the opportunity to work after the workshop in visual literacy with a team of colleagues, including Michael Hooksman, who is here with us in the room, also Sandra Jeppesen and Ayo Yulthin, who I think might be here, and also David Van Dyke. And we thought about the Capitol riot, particularly from a digital media perspective, and how was that covered? What kind of imagery, for example, in my particular case, emerged from the riot, and what does that tell us about the event itself and the individuals that were partaking? And in this particular slide, I wanted to bring out, I thought it was quite interesting. Parler is obviously or was and may will be again a right-wing social media platform that was instrumental in the organization of the Capitol riot. And shortly after the riot, it was taken down because the servers, Amazon was a server for that, revoked the services. But there was a user named Donk MB who scraped all of the visual content, the videos, the still images, and put that in a document or a website by ProPublica to make it all accessible. And this was another way that I thought was really interesting to hold people to account. So what I've highlighted here is that there was this element of send us a tip. So this idea of people going into a database of visual coverage of a particular event to pull out information about, violent individuals and abuses. So I thought that might be interesting in this particular conversation to talk about looking at images together as a collective and talking about what those images mean and what they tell us. So I also thought I would wrap up with bringing the Iranian protests into focus, particularly because, as Jolene said, this has been something that has recently been in Western media coverage, but also obviously there's a history of how the Iranian people are covered by Western media. And there's this wonderful study that this scholar Samira Durrani did in 2020 that I find quite interesting. Disagree and You Shall Be Valued, a semiotic examination of how photojournalism constructs valuable Iranians' bodies across time. And the reason time is in italics is because she actually looked at Time magazine over the course of a number of years, from 1981 to 2010, pulling out 376 images anytime Iranians were visually represented. And the analysis that she did shows that, in particular, visual treatment of Iranian people, particularly women, there was an embedded sense of the ideologies of the West. So, for example, if the long shot was used to portray a woman it was to represent that distance between the ideologies of the person and the narrative of othering. So, for example, if women were trailblazing or considered to be aligning with Western ideas of progress, then the photograph of that woman was taken at a much closer distance, as if there was a real sort of connection being represented visually, or as the title suggests, that this is a more valuable body because this person aligns with the ideals that we see. So that's the main crux of what I wanted to share today, was a little bit of a glimpse into the COVID work that we did, but also bringing it into more recent contemporary circumstances and reiterating that that idea from Kevin that it's not necessarily about one particular issue, but about how all of the issues are visually communicated, visually represented, and how these biases are making their way into visual representation. And there are methods by which, through semiotic analysis and through conversation, whether that happens online or in person, that we can call out these issues. So with that, I would like to introduce Rohit, and also to find out a little bit more from your perspective in terms of what it's like to create these spaces of dialogue. So I'll introduce Rohit. Rohit is the director and professor at the Bombay Institute for Critical Analysis and Research. So as Kevin mentioned, it's called BICAR, based in Mumbai. And he adds this at the end of his bio as if it's a side note, but however, this is a tremendous space for creating and fostering critical thinking, and I can't emphasize that enough. So Rohit is also the co-editor of Lacan Contra Foucault, Subjectivity, Sex, and Politics by Bloomsbury. He's taught multiple courses in philosophy, critical theory, historiography, and also politics in a number of locations, including in Chicago, Paris, Beirut, and Mumbai. He was awarded the Fulbright DDRA and the Andrew M. Mellon Fellowship for his PhD dissertation, research in primary sources in Lebanon. So he has a BA from Harvard College and a master's in philosophy of science and political sciences from University of Cambridge. So as someone who has a vision for pedagogical practice, I was hoping to invite you to speak a little bit about, from your perspective, how these spaces of learning and dialogue can be built around visual literacy, particularly within the context of social change. So thank you so much again, Rohit, for being here today, and I hand it over to you.
Okay, wow, okay. First of all, am I audible? Because I've gotten these new headphones that don't seem to be even working. They're in my ears, but I think that it's how old I've gotten.
We can hear you loud and clear.
So I just have had headphones, my ears, where I thought I was hearing them through them, but I don't think I am. Okay, great. But thank you so much, Miranda, for that overly kind introduction. It's actually quite. I forgot a lot of my past. You know, I've learned to unlearn it. Thanks also to this amazing visual literacy program that Kevin, colleague, a dear friend, and Jolene, of course, as well as you. You know, I learned and unlearned so much with you all through that time in COVID. And why I like that, I've forgotten about anything you just said about me. I was like trying to remind myself that you know, is that what you guys made me sort of see in some ways is that said I needed to go back to just thinking about what an image is. So I'm much more boring, I think, than you all as well. My teachers really. I don't have slides or anything because I just have like sort of a blank tabula rasa from where Bikar, for instance, has been trying to think about teaching the image today. We're currently doing a course on film and photography, and like what we are trying to figure out fundamental questions like what the difference is between film and photography. Like, and we can't come up with it. We had the brilliant filmmaker Hassan Salhab with us yesterday. He was also struggling with us to try and figure out what that difference is. What is an image? You know. So I'm going to start, and I will take about 5 minutes, I think, because you all have said much more that we could open it up. I think what I finally sort of learned to do as a student, and then of yours, of all three of you, Jolene, Miranda, and Kevin, and then trying to teach, and form courses on the image, especially in this time of crisis of COVID, is I've learned that we had to go back to thinking about fundamental questions of what are we saying, like, I mean, everything is like, what do we speak? What are images? They're bad. They're awful. And so what we've tried to do in some ways is try and think about how images might not be bad, how speech might not be bad, right? In a certain way, like what is good film? What is a good photo? Right? How do you even judge that? Right, the difference between, given precisely what all three of you, I think, and the world has taught us, which is that there are manipulative images, there's manipulative speech. Speech is necessarily deceptive, right? We can always say humans are the only people who are able to pretend to lie, right? Because they can speak, right? They can say something, and somebody can always say, is that true? Is that true? And that's very similar, I think, to the image. So I think what this period of rest of sorts of COVID and amidst Capital's spectacular assault of images that I grew up with, might be dating myself for some of the audience, but as somebody who's just turning 42 soon, I grew up with an assault of images and an assault of speech. Like what the visual literacy program that Kevin, thankfully formulated with you and Jolene and Nadine, who's not with us, but taught me was that, like, okay, here's what I want to do is I want to think about speech and images in a way that might be radical, political, like transformative. Like, what is good film? Again, good film, good. How do we talk? How do we articulate something that might not be deceptive to the other, right? Who is seeing the image or who is hearing our voice. Right. This took me a lot of thought. Again, thanks to you all, and thanks to a lot of sort of other colleagues like Hassan, who came in to help me try and structure this pedagogy. And I think it's something as simple as this: like, can an image, right? So this is very different from, I think, what Jolene and my colleagues like Jolene, Miranda, and Kevin just said, right? What I want to try and grasp or try and construct is a way in which we can talk about how an image which I cannot differentiate from a word. I feel like a child right now, right? And I think that's a good thing. I've unlearned. I think it's a tabula rasa. Can an image, can speech, like what we say, right, actually be for another? Right? Can it be for another? And what does it look like to make that film or that photograph, or to say that to a lover, to another, to a mother, to a friend, to a stranger, right? What does it mean to make a photograph, an image, which I no longer differentiate from speech at all, right? What does it mean to construct something like a political image, right? A political way of speaking, right? That unlearns precisely what my colleagues have I think, very well articulated, that we need to unlearn, right? These manipulative images that are assaulting us, especially in a time of rest, in a time of lockdown, in time of forced silence, right? What and internet and technology, what does it mean to think, to take that seriously, to take that time of rest, of silence, of a tabula rasa, of a creatio ex nihilo, seriously, with regards to both image and language, right? Which, again, I want to treat as identical, right? What does it mean to make that, right? We taught, like, and this was a very difficult pedagogy to create, and we've been trying to do it, and there are no silver linings to pandemics, right? I mean, it's a horrible thing, but if I can say that there was a silver lining in some sense to this pandemic, it was that it just allowed us to, Picard, to me, to erase, to completely unlearn the society of the spectacle, to start from, like, almost like a pure Cartesian space of, like, I doubt everything, right? I'm silent. I have to be silent. No image. Like, I can't take it. I'm in full anxiety, full paranoia, right? But that is what allowed us to start thinking about how to teach and create new images, new ways of talking to one another, right? Which is tremendously pedagogic for me as well. I mean, part of the reason why I don't have any slides is because this is still very much work in progress. We're figuring this out together with filmmakers, with photographers. We're questioning the very idea of what it means to be why is there a difference between a photographer, between a filmmaker, between a linguist, right? I mean, between somebody who speaks, right? Everyone wants to talk about iPhone cameras. They can capture evidence. Now everyone can have a camera. Everyone can be a photographer. Is photography art? Is it just amateur? Is everything amateur, right? Or we don't even, we're not even in our educational system, we're not able to understand these distinctions as a result of precisely the unlearning that we've gone through because of the assault of the society of the spectacle, which means not just images, but the coincidence of images and languages that I think we as an institution learned, right, and shaped our pedagogy this way. What we learned, I think, now, with colleagues like Hassan, with colleagues like Walid Sadek, with colleagues like those here, Jolene and Miranda and Kevin, is that to make an image, you always have to make. So this is, again, this is not about what my colleagues talked about, which is, yes, the assault of images, the assault of language, of deceit, which is fundamental to anything we see as humans, or that we say as humans. It's built into it. What we learned was how to make an image that builds in, that takes into account the very notion of the fact that it can be doubted. So what does that look like in a time of COVID, in a time of Trump, in a time of I don't know, Rishi Sunak? I mean, I'm in Bombay, and my phone doesn't stop with. It's very weird. I mean, like, these are really right-wing people, right? Priti Patel, Rishi Sunak, right? Like, these are really, really extremist right-wing people who are being celebrated as the Empire Strikes Back, right? Images, Dishi Rishi, right? Language, hashtags, which I'm just learning about, embarrassingly to my students and my colleagues, but I know, but India is celebrating Britain's first Indian Prime Minister, who is he's more right-wing than Thatcher. The images he produces, right? The images he produced in the run-up to his overthrow of another right-wing prime minister recently, Truss, right? Were pictures of, like, I was in London seeing these images on the metro, right? Like, they're like, he actually created a campaign. He orchestrated this campaign of creating images of ballerinas, of artists painting, dancers dancing, crying after they finished, saying, "Give it up," is what it said. Get a job, right? I think the way forward, again, with regards to imagery, and stop here because I think we should have discussion. Our colleagues Jolene, Miranda, Kevin, who taught me a lot about the assault of images, is to think about how to make the image, how to build into the image the possibility of you doubting what you're seeing. What does that look like? That looks like an Antonioni film. Go watch The Adventure or L'Aventura. Go watch Imamura Shohi's films. Go watch his A Man Vanishes. Go watch Ghassan Salhab's films. Go watch his Beirut Phantom. Or these are films that allow you, like we are children in this day and age with regards to language and images. Thankfully, like and that's the only lesson we should learn, is that we are infantile right now in this moment of our contemporary. Is that we can rediscover film and imagery of creation, and how to create out of just the tabula rasa of the image, of even words, and so let's, like, I guess I'll just stop here now and we can open it up. I know Miranda was unmuting to shut me up, so but let's stop here. But like, just by way of discussion, maybe we could talk about what it not only means for an image to assault us, right, to manipulate us, for language to assault us and manipulate us, but what it might mean for us to take this opportunity of the fact that we know now that images assault us, that language manipulates us, to create a new language, to create a new imagery, to create a new cinema.
Thank you so much, Rohit, for that. I think you're absolutely right, and your sentiment about doubting everything really does connect back to the beginning of the discussion, and Kevin's notion about no image is neutral, and we really need to question everything that we see. And think more clearly about the process of image making, and who is it made for, and why do they make it, and what are they saying through imagery, the same way that we ask those questions about text, as you've said, and then to find new ways of talking to one another that perhaps is far more conscious of that, because now we use imagery to communicate with one another. Everyone that has, access to a smartphone can do that. And so what does it mean when we're doing that and we're not questioning images? So I noticed Melanie had a question in the chat. I'm not sure if I've understand everything that you're saying, and this was during your conversation, Rohit, but it brings me to ask this question: what is not in the pictures and which would allow me to be in the world? And if Melanie is here, perhaps if you want to elaborate and jump in, you're welcome to. Otherwise, Rohit, maybe your thoughts on that question.
Melanie, do you want to jump on and phrase it? Otherwise, I can suspect what you're saying, and I think my colleagues will probably have something to say.
I thank you for following my question. Unfortunately, I'm not very fluent in English, so I don't feel superbly at ease. So please just feel free.
I'm too fluent in English. I have a very Pennsylvanian accent.
Could I add something to this? Who is not in the photograph? And I'm thinking about the viewer and polysemy, the fact that photos are without an anchor, that we all bring our own interpretation to it. This has been coming up for me during the talk today, and some of the really sensational insights that I've heard.
Well, can I say something very quickly on Melanie and now Michael's articulation? I think, and then pass it on to, I think, Jolene and Kevin and Miranda will have more to say about this. But so yeah, this is the question. It's like who is not in the image? It's a beautiful way of putting this, right? I mean, and here I think of like what we talked about in, just because Miranda asked me to talk about pedagogy and what we teach. We taught Eugene Atget's photographs quite intensely. He's late 19th century photographer. Walter Benjamin, who was who wrote a short history, a little history is a better translation, I guess, from the French photography. A less known essay. Really loved Atget's photographs precisely because he's shooting, like he's photographing in the late 19th century empty Parisian streets, right? What is so captivating, what makes this a good photograph is precisely the fact that the viewer and the photographer can't find someone in the photograph, right? There's a guilt, there's a sense of a crime that's happening on an empty, like just an empty Parisian street. It's not populated. These are Atget's photographs. You can go to the MoMA or whatever. They have all of the whole collection of Atget. It almost feels like a crime scene, but there's nothing there. So that is a good photograph. It makes you see something on the surface, on the phenomenon, right, of the surface, just scanning as, won't get the photographic theory, but I've been nerding out on it as an infant, which my colleagues made me become. But just on the surface, you can see something that is not there, right? It makes your mind want to move. This just empty Parisian street, it feels like something is happening, but nothing is happening on the surface, but something is happening on the surface. It's a suspension of evidence. It's not the presentation of evidence, as we typically think of documentary photography or images. It's documenting something, it's proving something. No, this is photography that suspends evidence, that makes you act, think, as a viewer, as a photographer. So I'll say that. I think hopefully that speaks to, I think it was Michelle and then Michael.
Thank you, Rohit. And I wondered, Kevin or Jolene, if you wanted to share any last sentiments. We are wrapping up the session, but I did want to extend an opportunity for some last thoughts, if you had any.
Thank you, Miranda. This was great. Rohit takes me into a level of deepness that I really want to process a little bit more, but I love this idea of what you're not seeing and this unlearning. So I really appreciate Rohit always and forever. He causes me to really do some deep critical thinking.
Thank you, Jolene. Kevin, any last thoughts?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I would want to explore Rohit's, both of the tangents that he's put out, like one of the kind of the new language, and the second of the kind of cascading mind of like just of moving forward. I think they're both very compelling. They're both very compelling kind of propositions to move forward with. Because I think, yeah, maybe also potentially are kind of stuck in the idea of how we're looking at the image now. Perhaps there is a certain recreation or a new sort of impetus to give it, to sort of take it somewhere else. So it's great that that's been sort of signposted and indexed now. So thank you, sir.
Thank you to all of you. Go ahead.
You know, this was so short. I'd like again, I like Miranda, like Kevin, Jolene, like I had no idea that we didn't. Okay, go ahead, Miranda.
No, I think it was really wonderful, the ideas that you shared, and I think it was nice to end on a note that is exploring, the theory behind it and what drives us to understand imagery as knowledge, and how can we look at an image the way that we look at text and really question it. And so there's lots to think about, and from a pedagogical perspective, how do we create spaces to have these conversations? And I think this was one space, and there have been others made by yourselves in Vicar and in Juniper Mind to just encourage these conversations to take place, where we can understand other people's perspectives and what they're taking away from an image, which is always enriching. So I want to just say thank you so very much to Kevin Jones, to Jolene Frizzle, to Rohit Goel for sharing this space and your energy, your ideas, and your thoughts about visual literacy and its ability to influence social change and how it reflects our society for better or for worse. And I hope that the audience enjoyed the conversation, and thank you for your questions and for contributing, Melanie and Michael and Andrea and others who I might have missed. I'm grateful for you sharing this space with us and challenging the ideas. And I think we can wrap up with that, unless anyone has a final thought. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so very much to the presenters. Thank you to the audience. And we hope to see you in the next sessions that are taking place. Do join us in happy hour to continue the conversation as well. All of that can be found on the website, and I'll drop that in the chat just now. Thank you to everyone. Have a wonderful evening or day, depending on where the time zones find you.